This video was intended to be much longer, almost 10 hours long in fact. Due to unforeseen complications though, I'm instead going to upload it in a series of smaller parts. If you haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend you start there before continuing. Link in the description. It's probably already abundantly obvious which of these characters will turn out to be the better. Not necessarily because Shinji is a poorly written character, even though that's not yet to be confirmed, but rather because Waver Velvet and his servant Ryder are highly regarded as the fan favorites because of how well they're written. We'll see how true that is, but because Ryder isn't the only relevant character, we also have to talk about his master, and how Waver came to join the war. We first meet Waver Velvet in episode 1, who is a studying and aspiring mage in London. His professor recites, to both the audience and his classroom, the nature of a mage's legacy before summarizing an essay that Waver had written as a side project. Magic can't be mastered by a single person or generation. The passing down of one's magical circuits to the next in line is an important step in growing and exploring more that magecraft has to offer. Because of this, lineage is something heavily valued by mages. The longer a line continues, the more advanced their most recent generation is likely to be in magecraft, and the closer to mastery their offspring are able to reach. Waver's paper presents the opposite, that someone can improve to the level of mastery even if their family has only practiced magecraft for a couple of generations. His professor denounces this claim before mocking his student and laughing him out of the classroom. On his way down the hall, Waver bumps into a mailboy with a package for Kenneth, asking Waver to deliver it for him. Instead, he hopes to get back at his professor and takes it for himself, only to realize that it's a catalyst for the Grail War. Considering the scene is meant to explain how Waver came to join the war, the circumstances are rather convenient for him. First and most apparent, he bumps into the mailboy, inciting the series of events in the first place. This by itself is quite contrived considering he was walking down a straight corridor and should have seen the oncoming courier and vice versa. Yet the two bump into each other as though it wasn't obvious one was in front of the other. Further, the courier just happened to be carrying an important package for the professor, who Waver now has a motivation to want to screw over. And even more convenient is that the courier recognizes Waver as a student in Kenneth's classroom, choosing to trust him of all people with the package at all, and the contrivance doesn't end there. Waver would certainly have every motivation to want to steal the package, but instead takes it a bit further. He conducts some research into the rumors regarding Kenneth's participation in the mage tournament. Before he even knows what the Grail War is, before he's even opened the package, he immediately assumes a connection between the two. He doesn't even know yet that a catalyst is needed to perform the summoning, or even that a summoning is required at all. So even learning that the package is from Macedonia doesn't quite explain how he reaches this conclusion. Now, there's a common misconception about inciting incidents that assumes they're contrived by their very nature. This is not incorrect. If there wasn't an inciting incident, then there wouldn't be a story to be told. Out of all the possible people this inciting incident could have happened to, it happened to our main character. But it had to happen to someone. If not the character we know, then it'd be someone else, and the story would be about them instead. At least, that's the idea. It's one thing to say an inciting incident is plausible, but still exists within a statistically vast realm of alternative possibilities. It's another for all logic to imply that said incident shouldn't have happened. Had Waver not ran into the mailboy, had he not been a mailboy that specifically recognized Waver, hell, had he left to deliver the package a little bit earlier or later, the two would never meet, and the Grail War would possibly be without its seventh master. Contrast this with the opening of Iron Man. Tony Stark is kidnapped by terrorists in the Middle East because he's the president of a weapons manufacturing conglomerate and they want him to make them a weapon. He's in the Middle East at all because he's showcasing weapons to be used by the military against these terrorists. Both of these incidents are related to his involvement with weapons manufacturing. Thus, there isn't anything contrived about this as an inciting incident. The story couldn't have happened to anyone else but Tony. Does that mean there always has to be a reason? Not if the story is about whoever it could have happened to. You can say that some events are unlikely to happen to this person specifically, but you can't say it's unlikely to happen to anyone at all. Someone would have found the Death Note and the story would have been about them. But how many other people could have logically been kidnapped by terrorists in the Middle East with the skills to build an Iron Man suit? Probably not many, so you'd need more context to explain the circumstances of the event. The terrorists would need a motive for doing it, and there should be a reason a person with those skills is in the Middle East at all. With Waver, you can't say that just anyone would have taken his place if he never got Kenneth's package. Only he has a motivation to steal it in the first place, and we're not led to believe that there are any other mages that know about the war, the summoning ritual, or that it's even happening at this exact time. This is also what makes Ryunosuke's introduction contrived. They're contrived because these events aren't something that could reasonably just happen to anyone, so there needs to be a reason it happened to these characters specifically, because inciting incidents are not contrived by nature. All in all, the issue has less to do with contrivance and more to do with presentation. The outcomes could potentially still occur, but would need to be more believable or natural. Had Waver at least had a relation with the courier delivering Kenneth's package, any remaining conveniences could almost be ignored. Though that doesn't mean there wouldn't be others, but you get my point. Waver sees this as a chance to show what he's really capable of as a mage. He describes the Grail War as one that is indiscriminate of titles or legacies, the perfect place to earn prestige and prove his worth. We now understand Waver's motivation, and even his wish. He wants to show that he can be just as great as a mage as anyone regardless of their bloodline. It's an ideal introduction to his character, what motivates him, and the journey he'll be going on. He immediately takes a plane out to Japan. When he arrives, he prepares a place to live by hypnotizing 2 elderly citizens, and rewrites their memory to make them believe that he's their grandson. Later that night, with all of his preparations completed, he finally attempts the ritual to summon his servant, Ryder, Iscandar the Conqueror. Waver quickly finds his expectations of his servant to be drastically offset from Ryder's introduction. We first see him breaking out of a library, stealing geographic books and other maps. He makes no effort to conceal his escape until after Waver takes the books for him, and even proudly boasts that a king like himself is above such scrupulous tactics. We learn that it wasn't even Waver's idea to steal these maps, and that Ryder wanted them for curiosity's sake. His mind is hardly even focused on the Grail War, and at first all he can think about is his plans for world conquest after he wins, while Waver does very little to mitigate his antics. He is boisterous and exceedingly proud, though not to imply that Waver isn't by comparison. The difference in their demeanor is still very apparent from their first introduction. Ryder is a massive towering hulk of a man compared to Waver in more ways than one. In life, he had conquered more than half of the known world, and dreamed of conquering the other half, and then some. He still desires, even now, to reclaim that unfinished wish and conquer the entire world, defying all mortal and divine forces to do so. When Ryder hears that all Waver wants from the Grail is recognition, he bluntly denounces and belittles his master over his wish, calling it narrow-minded and stupid. And in many ways, it is. The Grail is described as a device that has near limitless potential to alter the material world, and the only thing he wants is respect. Ryder instead suggests wishing for things worth being recognized for, and once again Waver is undermined by yet another person above him. The scene does much more than show how greatly Waver underestimated the master-servant relationship, and that will continue as he learns how much different the Grail War is than he expected. But it also establishes a fundamental conflict Waver has with Ryder and his own self-confidence, which will persist throughout the story going forward. He tries to assert his authority as master over Ryder, but can only present his title as proof of that authority. Beyond that, he can do little more besides using command seals, which even then he still hesitates to use. Ryder is so much bigger and greater than Waver, not just in size, but in prestige and character, and his personality dominates the interactions between the two. Simply glaring at Waver is enough to make him lose his composure. This is also reflected yet again moments later when he asks Ryder to prove his worth as a servant. The chariot he summons knocks Waver down and leaves him speechless. All in all, this scene is quite excellent as an introduction for Ryder, but also a great setup for the inner conflict that we'll get more of. Their next scene further emphasizes this. Waver yet again tries to assert himself as master, telling Ryder to take spirit form when necessary, only to be ignored. Further, he's been the one gathering information, while Ryder has seemingly yet to do anything of contribution. He even scolds Waver for not being able to tell exactly who defeated Assassin and how. Though he never goes out of his way to oppose Waver, Ryder only seems to obey him as a courtesy, and only when convenient. His suggestions to use the Grail to grow taller or stronger, while somewhat general, is not far off from why Ryder is able to assert himself. He's more than someone with recognition, but earned that recognition based on how he presents himself compared to Waver. In some ways, he embodies what Waver should strive to be like. The night after Assassin's defeat, Saber and Lancer engage in their fight, while Ryder and Waver spectate from afar. Ryder in particular is hoping another servant or two can join so he can fight them all at once, but as the battle continues, Ryder is disappointed to see that Lancer may defeat Saber before then, and simply decides to jump in early. He immediately announces himself by his identity as Iscandar, rather than Ryder, and offers an alliance, only to be turned down by both of them. Before the fight continues, Lancer's master reveals his identity as Waver's professor. He threatens him with the kind of unspeakable horrors that would be expected of a mage battles, but Ryder reassures him, claiming that all those who hide in the shadows are cowardly. This draws the attention of Archer, offended by Ryder's remarks, and then Berserker soon after. The two fight, and Archer eventually retreats, leaving Berserker to attack Saber himself. Kenneth further orders Lancer to help Berserker, but Ryder intervenes to remove him from the fight. It does seem quite odd that someone who cares only about conquest would have preferred not to take the best opportunity available. Later, he says that he would allow Saber to finish her duel with Lancer and fight the winner, so he'd be waiting for one of them to die anyways. But it seems Ryder is not unfamiliar with concepts like chivalry and honor, and makes a distinction between different forms of conquests. There are those that are dishonorable, and those that are more worthy. Even though it would be more advantageous to let things play out, to him, claiming victory is not the same as simply standing atop those that lost by outside circumstances. Through this, he shares a lot of respect to both Saber and Lancer for the honor they showed each other, and couldn't stand to watch it sullied by Kenneth and Berserker. The next couple days primarily consist of the developing relationship between the duo. Ryder, having seen Saber go outside, repeatedly pesters Waver to buy him a pair of pants so that he can do the same. He also further gets to know the two elderly folk that Waver hypnotized. Despite going against Waver's orders to do any of these things, it seems to work out for him at each turn. At this point, Waver seems to just be looking for reasons to assert superiority over Ryder, despite how his efforts have been. Though before, Waver's bossiness could have been played off as simply expressing his desire for recognition in the form of assertion, now it seems that he may have developed a subtle resentment for Ryder due to his inability to command him in the way that he wants to. But there's not enough to confirm this yet. On the more noteworthy side of things, Castor's bounty has been placed, and Waver tries using water samples retrieved from the river to locate him by following spellcasting residue that might have been left in the water. And just as expected, they find a potential lead where Castor might be hiding. Unlike previously, where Waver's inner conflict comes from his confidence dwindling in the face of his servant, this time he is the one undermining his own skills, even when Ryder compliments it. It speaks a lot for how Waver's main conflict isn't with his servant, but with himself. Even if Ryder says he can't take satisfaction in his own work unless it's on his terms. This is also shown moments later. Due to his skills at alchemy, they manage to locate Castor's hideout, and for a brief moment, Waver reclaims some of that lost confidence. But even that would be soon subverted moments later. The two of them reach Castor's lair and find that it's too dark to see. Ryder warns the boy not to look and stay in the chariot, but having been shown not to want to take orders from his servant, Waver ignores his advice and lights the area to look at it anyway. This is further where we see the resentment Waver has for Ryder bubbling to the surface. Ryder was already established to be in the position that Waver strives to end up in by the end of his arc. Now he seems to be more aware of the difference between the two, and envies the kind of character that Ryder has, which earned him the status and recognition he wants just as much. The kind of recognition he's been unable to find himself.
He's upset so much more than that Ryder is difficult to work with, but also because he is everything Waver wants to be, yet fails to be, a constant reminder of his inadequacy.
This scene is much more than an understandable reaction to the horrors of Castor's actions, but also a reflection of Waver's views towards Ryder. But the moment is short-lived, as Assassin reveals themselves and tries to kill Waver. They're unsuccessful and retreat soon after. Ryder sets fire to Castor's hideout before leaving. Waver has had his understanding of the Grail War subverted yet again. Before, it was his misconception about the master-servant relationship, a misconception that he still seems to hold. Now he's seen the bloody truth of what the Grail War really is. He came into this fight expecting it only to be a contest to determine who is most fit for the Grail, completely ignorant of the ways that mages and their servants fight one another and what they're capable of. Worst of all, this is made apparent to him in the contrast between his reaction and Ryder's. Despite his servant's reassurance, he's understandably upset that he couldn't keep the same composure, further widening the distance between the two of them. Less than a couple hours later, the two spontaneously decide to give Saber a visit. It's not entirely explained why they do this immediately after their encounter with Castor, though it isn't completely untelegraphed. It's possible that he'd just want to show off his new clothes the night that he got them, but it's still an issue that there wasn't at least a throwaway line to imply as much, albeit a small one. At the Banquet of Kings, Ryder poses the idea that the servants could decide for themselves who was the most worthy for the Grail, rather than fighting over it. This is somewhat of an issue that had appeared once before in episode 5 that I had chosen to ignore. Much like when he proposed to Saber and Lancer to join his army and yield the Grail to him, the implication is that the Grail can be obtained without bloodshed at all. He has no reason to think that such a thing is even possible, yet he humors it without thinking. This isn't like his desire to want to conquer the world, which, while may seem difficult, at least has enough factors within it to make it seem like it's not entirely impossible to someone up to the task. In this case, Ryder has explicit knowledge that states why something like this is impossible, yet he still offers an alliance anyways. And this isn't even the last time he does it either. I don't get it. Not long afterwards, Archer arrives to join their banquet. The early moments of the scene show Ryder and Archer dominating much of the conversation, and the two get along quite well, all things considered. They reveal similar ideas of what a king is and should be. Ultimately, both fundamentally disagree on who should have the Grail, but ironically for the same reason. Before Saber weighs in on her own thoughts, she challenges what Ryder would use the Grail for. Up until now, we've been under the impression that he wants world conquest, and that's still true, but that isn't what he would wish for. This is something that is most telling about his character. Ryder is interested most of all in conquering the world himself. It's not reaching the goal that matters to him, but that he could do it on his own. This could also be reflected in his views towards Waver's wish, suggesting that it would be better for him to wish for methods to obtain recognition and respect, rather than just respect by default. Conquering the world means nothing to him if he can't do it on his own. Unlike virtually everyone else, whose strongest desires are the ones they'd have the Grail grant, Ryder would rather make his dream come true himself. In the grand scheme of things, the Grail is a very trivial step to making that happen. This also shows the ever-widening gap between him and Waver. It shows that Ryder has the confidence that he can make his dream come true without the Grail. Even though Waver joined to prove his worth, he still wants to use the Grail just to make people respect him. Saber fundamentally disagrees with the idea of a king who conquers and rules for the sake of the devotion of their subjects, like how Ryder and Archer do, instead describing a true king as someone who devotes themselves to the people instead. The exact nature of their disagreement is one that we can cover in Saber's segment. In the end, though, Ryder further reinforces the tenets of the king that he believes in. The subjugation of his people is not the point itself of a king, but rather what the king is able to inspire in those who serve. Someone who martyrs themselves cannot hope to do as much for their people, try as they might. This is the great irony of Saber's rule that Ryder describes, and this is most apparent in the next scene. At the tail end of their discussion, Assassin appears to challenge Ryder and force him to use his noble phantasm as a test. Before he does just that, he poses a question for their banquet, one that he intends to answer.
その王とはここをなるや否や。
ここであるしか。
ダメだな。全くもって分かっておらん。そんな貴様らには世が今ここで。
Ryder's ultimate noble phantasm is a reality marble, a mental image projected into the real world. In it are all of his subjects and followers in life. A massive army of heroic spirits that once served and followed him are allowed to continue to do so through the Grail War, the final testament to his life's work and the result of his conquests. Not just of the lands, but of the people. Those who he befriended and swayed with his words were themselves also conquests, and a king who embodies all of the extremes that Ryder describes, such that they can inspire their people, is what brings them together and gives a king their power. Thus, a king does not stand alone. After slaying Assassin, Ryder leaves and denounces Saber's claim to kingship. The episode as a whole does a lot to further cement the character that's just been established, but the overall center of its plot is Saber, so there's not much more to talk about in the context of this character anyways. If there's one criticism that I can offer for this scene, Ryder states that a true king does not regret their rule, and further seems to imply that under no circumstance would he undo the fall of his kingdom, because that would show regret. And that's honestly probably the biggest assassination of his character, I'm sorry. What I take issue with is the contrived foundation of their argument. Ryder takes issue with Saber wanting to use the Grail to undo the fall of her kingdom, which makes no sense to me at all. Why would Alexander the Great take issue with someone wanting to ensure their kingdom's survival?
I do not believe that Iscandar never took steps to prevent his lands from being taken back, and that is pretty much what Saber is doing with the Grail and her kingdom. How is using resources to prevent your kingdom from falling any different from using a magic god cup to prevent it? The only difference is that one is being done retroactively, and that hardly matters. And why doesn't he see eye to eye on her with this? Because it means he would show regret. First of all, that's not how you use that word.
その滅びは必要だ。痛みもしよう。涙も流そう。だが決して悔やみはしない。
What the hell did you just say?
If this is supposed to demonstrate the virtue that you shouldn't dwell on mistakes you made in the past, I could respect that, but the reason why you shouldn't dwell on the past is because you can't change the past. These characters all believe that the Grail is more than capable of changing the past, so why is it a bad thing to want to change it if it be for the better? If you can't change something, past or future, you should accept that and move on from it. If you can, you should make an effort, especially if it's in the past. Like, really ask yourself, can you really say there isn't a single event in history you would have changed if you had the chance to prevent it? People are shown to have died, hundreds that Saber commanded and ruled lay waste on a battlefield she wanted never to have happened. And Ryder thinks it's an insult to those same people who died to have not tried to prevent them from dying in the first place? It makes no sense. I'm not saying Ryder should follow the same wish as Saber. He believes continuing the legacy of his kingdom is a more gainful venture, and I understand him choosing that over wanting to undo that same kingdom's fall. At the same time, I don't think he'd dismiss Saber's wish any more than he would anyone else's. Like I said, much of the argument is contrived because it goes against Ryder's character just to make it happen. I can talk more about it later, but at the very least it develops his character more than plenty, as contrived as it was to get there. About a day passes and Waver wakes up from a dream of Ryder's memories, featuring an ocean that Ryder had discovered in life. This inspires him to visit the amusement district that morning, though denies having any interest in it outside of a change of scenery. Ryder explores the arcade, and Waver spends his time in the library reading about his servant and the dream he had. The ocean he saw was Okeanos, the sea that Ryder wanted to reach in life. He gave control over his lands that he had conquered just so that he could see it. This scene is important because it recontextualizes what could have been misinterpreted previously. Though they've been small, there have been hints that Waver holds some semblance of envy towards Ryder. But what appears on the surface as slight resentment, we now see that what Waver also feels is admiration. Ryder then appears to show off his new video game he purchased while mocking Waver's height again and further questioning his master's judgment in the same vein as he did in episode 2. Before Waver can further denounce his servant's antics, Ryder sees the book about himself. Waver has tried his best to present himself as someone above Ryder, trying to at least appear as the master to his servant, despite how they've turned out. His pride has made him reluctant to want to admit his admiration to his own servant, admiration that Waver likely wishes he could have as well. To further reinforce this, Waver opens up the book to a page and points out an excerpt which says that Ryder was very short. Not historically inaccurate, considering Alexander the Great was said to be around 5 feet tall. Yeah, I'm not kidding. And King Arthur wasn't a girl, I know, shocking, right? But despite this inaccuracy, Ryder finds only amusement in this.
やはりどこの誰とも知れんやつが書き留めたものなんぞ当てにならんもんだわい。
Waver is surprised at the textbook's lack of recognition to Ryder's stature, especially one that's been a core of his character's presentation so far, doesn't bother him, likely juxtaposed to how he would react the exact opposite in Ryder's position. Waver has been thus far defined as someone motivated entirely by his desire to receive recognition from others. It would make sense why he's taken aback by Ryder's indifference to history's unkind depiction of his height, whereas Waver likely would have taken it more personally. The differences between these two characters grows ever larger, and Waver becomes more aware of it. On their way home, Ryder notices something eating away at his master. Waver reveals that given how powerful Ryder is as a servant, he couldn't take pride in winning the Grail, and further suggesting that he would have preferred having a pact with Assassin instead.
多分死んでるぞ、貴様。
いいんだよ。僕が僕の戦いで死ぬんなら文句ない。
征服は己自身に託す夢。聖杯に託すのはあくまでもそのための第一歩だ。
Even if it kills him, Waver wants desperately to prove that he's worth as much as he believes. He wants to prove he's every bit as capable and up to the task as every other master, and despite the victories they might have had, they've almost completely been because of Ryder. And while this is not entirely true, Ryder's actions do undermine the accomplishment of locating Castor's hideout, in spite of the end results. He can't stand to fight side by side with someone who will take any bit of credit for his victory and rob him of any satisfaction.
いかんせん背丈を伸ばしたいってだけが悲願じゃな。そんなに焦らんでもよかろうて。何もこの聖杯戦争が貴様にとって人生最大の見せ場ってわけじゃなかろう。
何よ。
Waver's wish is simply recognition. It's not to seek atonement or redemption, to wreak havoc upon the world, to reach the root of magic, to save the world, or even to rule it. Just recognition. Something so trivial in comparison, millions of other humans before him have found it on their own, many without magic. The Grail War, for as important as it is just a single method for obtaining it, but Waver isn't reassured. In spite of this similarity, he further tries to broaden the distinction between the two of them, pointing out that Ryder has no more interest to serve him than he does to be his master. Waver can't stand his inferiority to his servant. He is so much bigger and greater than anything he could even aspire to be, and it's only damaged his pride all the more. Iscandar returns with this.
ほれ坊主、見てみよ。世が立ち向かっている敵の姿を、ここに描かれた敵の隣に我らの姿を書き込んでみよ。
そんなのは。
これより立ち向かう敵を前にしては、貴様も世も同じ。
Ryder seeks heights unimaginable. He wants to single-handedly conquer the entire world for himself. One that's certainly possible, and yet so far out of reach even for him. Waver tries to reach the level of prestige and skill of some of the greatest mages, while having the added handicap of being from a small family of mages with mostly diluted blood. The size of their goals may seem different, but the scale is not as much so. Both try to reach heights greater than themselves. By that measure, the two of them are the same. Just 2 dots. What further cements this is when Ryder admits that he had never seen Okeanos, unlike what Waver had seen in his dream. Rather, what he saw was what Ryder had dreamed of, but never attained. He died never having achieved his life's goal, and yet, even after learning and accepting that such a thing was impossible, it is still one that he strives for. the same as Waver does. Glory lies beyond the horizon, challenge the unattainable. Their alliance is perfect, and Ryder would not have wanted to serve anyone else. The moment is cut short when Castor incites the battle at the river.
Yeah boy!
Ryder positions Castor in the way to allow Saber to finish him off, though the fight had left him extremely exhausted and nearly depleted of mana. A day after the subsequent morning, Waver leaves the house and prepares meals and a sleeping bag for a temporary change of scenery. He plans to rest at the site where he first summoned Ryder in hopes that it would help restore his mana more efficiently. I don't know why he didn't do this the day before, since it didn't seem like he was doing anything noteworthy then either, but whatever. He says that he never noticed until after the fight how much mana Ryder's Noble Phantasm consumes. It appears that he's mostly gotten along with his own mana reserve, rather than relying on his master's. He's used so much of it in fact that he can no longer take physical form, and decided against using Waver's mana at the risk that it might kill him. Waver reiterates his thoughts that he expressed 2 days prior, that this was a battle he chose to enter. Regardless of who he fights with or what outcome, he chooses to live with the consequences. If fighting his very best means putting his life at risk, he accepts that. But Ryder proposes a counter that Waver never considered, that the Grail might not actually be real. Ryder spent his life searching for Okeanis, a place that never existed. Many who were swept up by its tales of majesty and wonder, none of which could be confirmed, followed him on a daunting quest where many died along the way. After having lost so many, Ryder doesn't want to see more fools die searching for something that may not even exist. This also foreshadows events yet to come. Just as Okeanis wasn't real, the Grail too will also turn out to be a farce. And yet, even with that possibility, Waver rejects Ryder's concerns, asserting once more, and this time with confidence, that he is Ryder's master. He spends the rest of the day sleeping as the two plan to go after Saber next, and then Archer thereafter. After a few hours, they decide to scout the area from above, and their search yields results as Saber gives chase under the belief that they've kidnapped Irisfiel. He then changes tactics to challenging her head-on, all the while hoping that the experience may convince her to join his army. Even at this very moment, despite his negative opinion of her as a ruler, he still desperately desires to see her at his side. He has no respect for her as a king, but so much more for her as a knight. Just as he sees every other friendship and bond he's ever created as a conquest no different than this. He repeats to himself, glory lies beyond the horizon, as he charges into a fight that he cannot win, once again challenging the unattainable. He and Waver are left without their chariot, completely destroyed by Saber's Noble Phantasm. Ryder withholds from using his in turn, having only one usage left and hoping to use it against Archer. As luck would have it, however, Saber retreats and the two are forced to walk home. After returning, he's greeted by Mr. Mackenzie, who offers Waver to join him on the rooftop and watch the sunrise. After some encouragement from Ryder, he takes the man up on the offer. The two share a drink, and Mr. Mackenzie reminisces on his past, having built this very house at this very spot in order to stargaze, hoping to one day stare up at this same night sky on the rooftop with his grandchildren. Grandchildren that ultimately never came. Whether by the man's force of will or Waver's immaturity, he sees through the deception that was fed to him from the beginning. His wife has been happier than she's ever been before. Their grandchildren have seldom come to visit them and never allowed their dreams when they built this house to come true. Now, a random stranger posing as their grandson has gifted them with the opportunity that they wish they could have. He has every right to be mad at Waver for altering his memories, and yet he has every reason to be happy that he can share such a moment with someone such as Waver. He asks the boy to stay a while longer, but to his disappointment, Waver cannot make that guarantee. He cannot tell him honestly that he and Ryder will come back safely.
命と計りにかけられるほどの事柄なんて結局のところ一つもありはせんものじゃよ。
Based on everything else in the anime, this clearly isn't true from a general perspective, but it certainly applies to someone as ordinary as Waver or Mr. Mackenzie. Though Waver is by no means ordinary, his dreams and desires for the Grail are hardly comparable to anyone else in the war. It's a moment of self-reflection, where Waver must ask himself, is recognition so valuable to him that he would risk his life for something as small as that? Ryder is absolutely right that there will be other opportunities for him to prove himself. The Grail War will not be the most important event that defines his life as a mage. Someone as dedicated as him will always have a chance to seek and achieve the status he desires, so is the Grail so important to him that it's worth risking his life for something so ordinary? Waver rests for the next 24 hours, waking only on the following nightfall. The two believe that this will be their final battle. Only the strongest servants remain, and their fights may conclude before the night is over. Suddenly, a bright monosurge is fired off into the sky in the distance, telling all who could see it where Kirei and Karya are stationed, and challenging the remaining masters to a final duel. Ryder summons his steed, ready to ride off into the fray, but Waver hesitates, and using the last of his command seals, he orders Ryder to win the last fight, obtain the Grail, and take the world for his own. In this moment, he accepts that he will not be like Ryder, that he cannot live to be the master worthy to lead him, that the power of the Grail would be wasted on a wish as simple as his. It's clear that his stepfather's words have weighed heavily on his mind. In these final moments of the war, where only the strongest may continue, Waver finally admits his unworthiness.
もちろんすぐにでも行かせてもらうが、
なんでまだ僕を連れて行く？僕は
マスターじゃないにせよ、世の友であることに違いはあるまい。
In spite of this, master or not, Ryder believes Waver has faced the same enemies and survived the same trials, making him his ally, his friend, and his equal. Waver can hardly hold himself back. His whole life, he has been looked down upon by mages who were born luckier than he, who proved more skillful than he, and in less time. All the while, he has wanted nothing but for those around him to acknowledge him as their equal. This is what he's been searching for this whole time, and having accepted Ryder's words, rides off with him into the final battle the two of them would ever fight side by side. As they approach the source of the flare, they're intercepted by Archer. The two servants in turn also have their final banquet, at which Ryder proposes that if they were allied, there would be no one in the universe that could stop them. Archer is amused by the question, but ultimately declines. The only remaining requirement is to fight. He summons his noble phantasm, the Ionian Hetairoi, the culmination of his life's work, his allies and armies, the proof of his conquests, and his dreams. They all charge at the King of Heroes, and with barely more than a swipe of his weapon, Archer annihilates every last one of them. They begin to vanish and disappear before his eyes, but Ryder refuses to look back. He refuses to dwell on even a second of the past, even as his men fall and perish to their untimely demise. Just as he led them to Okeanos, he moves forward onto the glory beyond the horizon, until finally, Ryder awakens from his dream, stopping himself mid-charge only to ask Waver something important, knowing now that this is the end.
神として世に仕える気はあるか？
同じ夢を見させてほしい。
後世に語り継ぐのが神たる貴様の務めである。生きろ、ウェイバー。
Having accepted Ryder's proposal, Waver is tasked with carrying Ryder's dream and inspiring others just as he has. He orders Waver to live, and charges off towards the horizon. A phrase aptly describing his character. Reaching the horizon is impossible. No matter how close you get to it, it will always be out of reach. And yet, that is the reason to seek it. To reach for the unattainable heights that weren't meant for anyone. Not to obtain it, but for the sake of the journey to it. For the glory that comes simply by doing it. To reach heights unimaginable will still require soaring higher than you ever had before, higher than anyone before, inspiring those around yourself, and in turn encouraging them to seek it as well. To challenge the rules of this small world of ours, and to grow as people ourselves. And yet, it will always be out of reach. As Ryder slowly fades, Archer approaches Waver, saying that he must take up his arms to avenge his fallen king. Waver refuses, having been ordered by his king to survive. Archer respects the boy's unwavering devotion and loyalty, and retreats to join the remaining servants in the final battle of the Grail War, leaving Waver to mourn the death of his king. It should come as no surprise that Ryder is one of the most popular characters in Fate Zero, if not the fan favorite out of all of them. His entire character is about chasing the impossible, not to achieve that impossibility, but rather for the sake of his conviction. If chasing the impossible is what allows us to grow as people, it's no wonder he's as popular as he is. Waver complements the duo perfectly, acting as the student in this student-mentor relationship. Due to his insecurities, Waver's arc is one that fluctuates much more dramatically than most other characters. He is arguably much closer to his ending at the start of the story than most other times. A major theme of his arc is always to remain hopeful and confident. He is so proud simply to be chosen by the Grail as a master that he sees this as proof enough of his worth, even though he knows 6 others were deemed as greater or equal worth by the same entity. It is only when that confidence is challenged that he shows he still has room for growth. Understand that none of the reactions Waver had during his journey were unwarranted. When he was horrified by the sight of Castor's work, Ryder acknowledged that his reaction was normal. It isn't that Ryder is saying he shouldn't feel the way he does, that he shouldn't feel small when he is, but that he should continue moving forward despite that. When faced with the people around him, Waver couldn't see any metric to measure himself by to show his worth, even though he was the youngest master in the war, even though he found Castor's hideout first. Until the final night of the war, Waver can only see the value of his accomplishments in comparison to the stature of others, Ryder most of all. After meeting his servant and working with him, he becomes much more aware of how small he is as a person. His inferiority becomes much more apparent, and his doubt grows, almost quitting the war on more than one occasion, but is reassured that the doubt that he has in himself is not a sign of hopelessness, but rather the opposite, that because he believes what he seeks is impossible, yet still chooses to chase it, is a sign that he follows the same conquering path that Iscandar did in life. Ryder is also perfect for this role, that he appears massive and larger than life. His stature and demeanor make him appear as a force to be reckoned with, and in many cases, he could be considered as much, when in truth, he does not possess the same feats as the other servants. Though still superhuman, he is not exceptionally fast for a servant. He is not exceptionally strong for a servant. On his own, he is arguably one of the weaker in the war, maybe even less so than Lancer, which makes his conviction all the more inspiring. The only real fights he partook in was against Assassin, Castor's Monster, Saber, and Archer. Of those, the first was the only fight he won. The other 3 ended, or would have eventually ended in defeat. This context already shows that he was never going to win the Grail. With a body tinier than a seed, the task of winning the Grail, let alone conquering the world, was far more out of his reach than even he could have realized. But I wouldn't blame you if you believed otherwise. It was his conviction, the same conviction that Waver adopts by the end of his arc, that was so strong it made him truly appear as larger than life. He openly announces his presence, riding across the skies in a massive chariot unconcerned with hiding in the shadows. This arrogance can almost appear as a vice, and it is. He admits to being foolish, chasing a goal made impossible by his own inadequacy. But ironically, it is this invincible spirit of his that demonstrates foolishness, is also the same reason he is not a fool. After all, despite having so little power himself, Ryder's greatest strength as a servant, a hero, and a king was how he could inspire others, to push forward even in literal impossible odds. It is the encapsulation of the indomitable human spirit, and for as much as this hopeful message contrasts with the tragic theming of almost every other character we've gone over thus far, it is this contrast that matters to the story of Fate Zero. We are about to discuss the greatest tragedies in this anime, ones that will contextualize everything that has come before as completely hopeless and an impossible outcome to overcome. Both Ryder and Waver show that one must not lose hope when presented with hopelessness, and in fact to move forward in spite of it. So for our 2 remaining protagonists, Saber and Kiritsugu, will they remain hopeful in the face of despair? And if they do, will it carry them despite that despair? Well, I suppose we can always hope. So how does someone like Shinji Matou hold up under the microscope? Surely he isn't a better character than someone like Waver, but how does he hold up on his own? Our first encounter with Shinji is in the prologue. When Tosaka arrives at school early, Shinji comes on to Rin a little bit too much. The creepy faces he makes as he closes the distance between the two also says something about his character.
He's very full of himself, completely consumed by the delusion that Rin is in any way attracted to him, while also ignoring her attempts to get away from him. This overconfidence is also displayed by his boastfulness, when he brags about his rank as captain of the archery club, even though he's only vice-captain. Of course, Rin shoots him down and points out his self-absorbed nature. Instead of recoiling from Rin's comment, Shinji verbally retaliates. He genuinely believes she has no right to point out something so negative about his character and completely denies any truth behind it. Someone else might simply take the loss and let things move on, rather than worsening what little bit of a connection they already have. Shinji, however, is not concerned that his response might burn that bridge, or perhaps he's unaware of it. He simply expected everything to work out for him, regardless of his behavior, and this could be because he has no attraction to Rin as a person, which would explain why he shows no considerations for her feelings as one, or how her view of him would only worsen after such an impertinent reply. Later that same day, we see he holds a level of resentment towards Shiro Emiya. Before class, he mocks Shiro for having quit the archery club in order to run errands for Issei. We get further insight when told that it was Shinji that convinced Shiro to quit. One of the things we find out later was that Shiro was good at archery, and might have been the best member. Mitsuzuri even hopes that he might come back for that reason. This could imply that Shinji had a sort of rivalry with Shiro. He might have been jealous that Shiro was so much better than himself. So jealous, in fact, that he takes it as a personal win that he managed to get Shiro to quit. After all, unlike someone like Mitsuzuri, he doesn't seem to want Shiro to come back.
ともかくお前はもう部外者なんだから道場に近づくなよ
The next day, we learn a little bit more about Shinji indirectly. Shiro immediately suspects Shinji beat his sister and gave her a bruise on her hand, though Sakura denies it. It's not entirely clear if this is an actual bruise or if this is a pattern of a command seal starting to form on her hand. It's still a reasonable conclusion, since Shiro also mistakes the command seal on his hand for a bruise. We never learn about Sakura's involvement in the Grail War in this route, so it's hard to say. Though the bruise doesn't seem to resemble any sort of symbol like the one on Shiro's hand does, but it really doesn't matter whether it is or isn't a command seal. Not only because it's mostly irrelevant to this route if Sakura is a master after all, but also because of Shiro's reaction. Implying this isn't the first time something like this has happened is an indication enough that Shinji is the kind of person that would beat his sister. Sometime before the day after, Shinji sets up the bounded field around the school. Mitsuzuri had implied that Shinji was the type to retaliate against rejection like he had the other day. It's not clear if this is the retaliation Mitsuzuri implied, but what could suggest it might be? Well, for starters, that he waited so long to actually put up the bounded field. We know from 2 days ago, when Rin was listening to the message left by Kirei, that the only two servants that hadn't been summoned were Saber and Archer, meaning Ryder had already been summoned well before the prologue. Something must have instigated him to act. Otherwise, if the bounded field were put up for his own interests, it would have been placed much sooner. To add to that, the decision to place the field at school was clearly made rather hastily. Shinji should know that the Tosaka family would be participating in the war, and that Rin would undoubtedly be a master herself. Especially if it were only to make Ryder stronger, there are plenty of other locations where there aren't masters, which would pose a much smaller risk to set the field at. Putting it at school would spark unnecessary conflict and direct unneeded attention to him. Not to mention we see it's incredibly easy to find, and placing it in a location where a master would find it makes putting it up near pointless. The only thing that doesn't support this being an impulsive decision is how obviously foolish the choice is, and how unlikely it would be for even Shinji not to realize the mistake in his judgment within as little as a day after making it. But we'll talk more about that as we continue. As the day ends, Shiro confronts Shinji about the mark on Sakura's hands. Shinji tries to brush him off and ultimately gives the impression that he doesn't care about Sakura. He's even further driven to anger when Shiro brings up that the two are siblings, implying that he doesn't believe that they are. Or at least he doesn't treat Sakura like his sister anyways. Ultimately, he convinces Shiro otherwise, but this only seems to further reinforce a resentment that Shinji also shares for his sister, implying all the more that beating her is something that he'd do. So he's a creep, he's self-absorbed, he's petty, a jerk, and he beats his sister. He just sounds like such an interesting character. I can't wait to hear more about him. Shinji was tasked with cleaning the dojo, but instead takes advantage of Shiro's kind nature and has him clean it up for him. The next morning, he isn't present at the dojo. It's implied that he's doing master-related activities, but it's unclear what these are. We don't know if he's hunting another servant, which one, or if he actually encounters one. More likely, he's gathering victims to fuel Ryder, as later that day he also attacks Mitsuzuri, but we're never given any further information about the whereabouts of these victims. Mitsuzuri, for example, is attacked after having some kind of altercation with Shinji when he stopped by late that evening. She was absent the following day, as was Shinji, and no one had heard from her until the next day after she was attacked, supposedly being found in an abandoned alleyway with no memory of what happened. That same evening, Shinji was apparently on school grounds again, attacking another random student to fuel Ryder. This does raise the question why he'd return to school just to siphon more energy for his servant. He doesn't need students specifically, surely anyone would do, and knowing that 2 other masters go to the same school means he could implicate himself by targeting other fellow students and staff. I had thought that this was why he didn't return right away. After all, his absence was brought up in the same conversation about Mitsuzuri. But if that was an issue for him, why attack students at all when that could direct more attention to him? Why even avoid school if he's not concerned about being implicated? Well, we learn that this could have been planned to lure Shiro or Rin. Though the nature of the meeting was unplanned, and his return to school is unclear, he further takes advantage of the opportunity when Rin and Shiro notice the prior attack. What's most interesting is that Ryder aims for Rin instead of Shiro. It's likely that Shinji specifically aimed for her because he still holds a grudge. Even though the rejection was nearly a week ago, he still holds resentment towards Rin. So he's just hoping that a student would cross paths while Rin happened to be nearby? Why? He has no idea that either she or any other student would be within the vicinity of one another so late in the evening, especially with the curfew that was intended, but I digress. So we know that he will not only use fellow students as a means to make Ryder stronger, but also does so out of spite. He's petty and reacts extremely to even the tiniest grudges, exhibiting very narcissistic and borderline psychopathic behavior. The day after Ryder's attack, Shinji comes back to school, spreading rumors about Mitsuzuri's attack. He speaks in not only a gleeful manner, but does this despite everyone believing that Mitsuzuri was just sick the day prior, as though he takes some level of pride in the attack, or as though to boast about it. Shiro and Rin locate and remove some of the sigils compromising Shinji's bounded field. Afterwards, he approaches Shiro in the hallway asking for an alliance. This does seem a bit odd that he'd ask for an alliance with Shiro, considering Ryder had tried to kill him the day before. He's not the slightest bit concerned that Shiro might take issue with his behavior recently, especially his attitude in class that morning. Why on earth would Shinji act this way if he wants him to cooperate? He doesn't show the slightest remorse or even apologize for what Ryder did before. Not even insincerely. Instead, he is completely and openly gleeful at the thought of his handiwork when Shiro confronts him. What's worse is that he knows he can't afford to continue without an alliance. He acts as though he'd be no worse off without allies at all, and if his frustration in episodes to come is any indication, he knows that's not true. Instead, Shiro turns down the offer because he doesn't believe Shinji will actually do anything to make the alliance worth it. Which is a strange thing to focus on, because from what we've seen thus far, we have little reason to believe Shinji is lazy. Inept, maybe, but the only example of anything resembling apathy is when he asks Shiro to clean up the dojo for him. If his absence the past 2 days are anything to go by, he's been relatively active as a master, at least from what we can gather. The next morning, at some unnamed time, Shinji offers an alliance with Rin. What's most strange about these offers is how, barely a couple days ago, he was trying to kill both of them. He doesn't consider she would reject him on those grounds. She doesn't, but the fact that he offers it at all is the strangest part. Being one to overreact to slights against him, Shinji activates the bounded field to spite the 2 of them. This is where we see his decision he made at its most foolish, and as an impulse becomes much less justifiable as a character decision, considering he's had half a week to properly assess the consequences of the decision. Keeping the bounded field at the same school where another master resides was not only inane on its own, but much less worth pursuing when Shiro became a master as well. Now 2 masters, both of whom would have every reason to oppose Shinji for his actions, are present at the site of his bounded field, and both would have invested interest to stop him if he activated it. It would be far more beneficial to set it up at some other location where there aren't so many enemy masters present. Even after they remove more of his sigils, he makes an effort to put them back up. Despite every reason suggesting he shouldn't, he continues to pursue the least viable options. But the decision to activate it at all is by far the worst decision he could make for the same reason. The most irrational thing about this decision is his belief that this will somehow get back at both Shiro and Rin. In a vacuum, it's not a bad plan, but the issue is that the field's effects can be circumvented with an extremely simple magical technique. He has now effectively put a target on his back by 2 masters he's aware of, and a third that he isn't. Later, he complains to Kirei that it was 2 against 1, and that he couldn't win against those odds. Yet he never considered from the beginning that he'd have to fight both of them in this eventuality anyways. And he's had more than several days to consider this, so it could hardly be chalked up to sheer impulse. Even the decision itself is far too stupid for anyone with the slightest bit of common sense to make after having 4 days to think about it. In any case, Kuzuki arrives and eliminates Ryder. That night he makes it to the church to seek refuge. After finding out he's the first out of the running, he blames his problems on Kirei, the church, the hosts of the Grail War, Shiro, Rin, virtually everyone except Kuzuki, the guy that actually eliminated him. In fact, what's most odd about this situation is that despite being one to hold grudges for the tiniest things, he holds no such resentment for the man that eliminated him from the Grail War, nor does he consider it when Kirei gives him a second chance to compete. 2 nights after, Gilgamesh arrives at the Matou estate in order to form a pact with Shinji as his new servant. It's not made clear why he had to wait 2 days to meet. Shinji says that he's going to get back at Shiro and Rin, reinforcing again the confusion why he isn't aiming to kill Kuzuki first and foremost, and never takes any interest in Castor or her master from now onward, even though they are the real reason he is in this situation. So, what do the two plan to do first? Well, unfortunately that question will never receive an answer, because we don't know what they're up to for the next 3 days. 3.5 days pass, presumably doing nothing, before the two eventually decide to go after Ilia in order to prepare the Grail. You would think that they'd try to eliminate at least some of the competition during that time, considering that all of said competition is controlled by Castor at this time. But not even Kuzuki is enough to entice Shinji to do something for 3.5 days. No, seriously, why the fuck isn't he at least a little bit upset by that? Gilgamesh drops Shinji in the middle of the Ainsburn castle. He immediately demands that they take him to Berserker's master, unaware that Gilgamesh hasn't prepared yet to protect him. The two maids threaten him, but luckily Gilgamesh appears just in time to rescue him. Berserker then engages him in combat, while Rin and Shiro arrive soon after to spectate from afar. Gilgamesh massacres Berserker and murders Ilia, tearing her heart out. After Shiro gives away his position, Rin appears from the staircase and threatens to kill Shinji if they don't retreat. With negotiations having broken down, Gilgamesh complies, telling Shinji that the heart will spoil, which doesn't make any sense from several perspectives, but we'll get to that in time. What do they do next? Well, that's another excellent question that we won't get an answer for. The two supposedly leave the castle, then slightly more than 24 hours later, they return to the castle after Archer had abducted Rin. Okay, but why? What did they return here for? For Archer? How did they know he'd be here? More questions without answers. Archer offers Rin, but only after his business with Shiro is concluded. He then threatens to kill both of them if they break this condition. Now, given that Shinji has been shown to overreact when things don't go his way...
お前そうかよそれじゃあ死んじゃえよともかくお前はもう部外者なんだから道場に近づくなよなんだってやれギルガメッシュ
You would expect him to simply have Gilgamesh kill Archer and be done with it, especially with Archer's comment that but you would be surprised to know that he's perfectly content with taking Archer at his word, especially when he just decides to go against it anyways before Archer's fight is over. How very convenient. A couple hours pass and Shinji starts to... be Shinji. I guess we can add guy to that list of character traits. Man, this character is just so interesting. Luckily, Lancer appears just in time to rescue Rin, but Kirei also appears, ordering Lancer to kill Rin and remove her heart. Lancer refuses and, well, you know the rest. There isn't much else to be said about Shinji. This is basically the end of his story. From here, he runs into Gilgamesh, who decides to use him as the vessel for the Grail. His body is used as the host, and Shiro, Rin, and Saber do everything in their power to get him out alive and defeat Gilgamesh. Wait, what? He's still alive? How? How? No, literally how? We were told just moments ago that the vessel needed to die first, right? That's why Kirei was going to kill Rin. Fuck, he was stabbed through the chest and he had a magical heart shoved into it. How the fuck does he survive this? You know what, don't answer that, or I'll never hear the end of it. As far as this character goes, there isn't much to be discerned in Bladeworks. He's your archetypal anime guy down to a T. He's self-absorbed, narcissistic, psychopathic, lacks any sense of empathy, and only views others as a means to reach an end. And why is he this way? I don't know. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. As you'll soon see with Gilgamesh, you don't need to expand on a selfish prick's background in order to make them nuanced in some way, or at the very least, good. And in the case of Ryunosuke, you don't need it either to at least play a valuable part to the overall narrative. The issue with Shinji is that's the only thing left he had going.
Virtually everything else about him was handled with about as much thought as Lancer's character. So, not much thought at all. Consider for a moment, what does Shinji accomplish for the narrative? He sets up a bounded field, which incites Rin to investigate, causing her to be present for the fight with Lancer, and resulting in Shiro's induction into the war. That's certainly his most notable contribution. He interrupts the fight between Rin and Shiro, and instigates the fight that results in both of them forming an alliance, and concluding that there's a third master at school. He offers an alliance to both Shiro and Rin, which reveals to them and the audience that he's the third master at school. This also subsequently motivates him to activate the field the next day, revealing the existence of a fourth master at school during his elimination. And he also acts as Gilgamesh's master and the core for the Grail. Compared to someone like Assassin, that's no short list, but it's no less contrived. Setting up the bounded field could be described as impulsive, but it's also implausible that someone, even as dumb as he is, wouldn't immediately realize the numerous strategic disadvantages. Equally as questionable is how he concludes that there aren't better ways to act on his anger towards Rin. He doesn't realize that Rin and Shiro won't be affected because they're also mages, and they'll both be gunning for him as a result. He couldn't possibly believe it would solve the problem. Attacking Rin would certainly be within his character, but it doesn't make much sense why he would be on campus, nor why he wouldn't have Ryder try to kill Rin or Shiro despite having the opportunity. His attempted alliances are really the only important decisions he makes that are in character,
but he mishandles those as well when he makes absolutely no effort to convince Shiro or Rin to join his team beyond just expecting that they would. As for his role as Gilgamesh's master and the core for the Grail, as we'll talk about later, it's questionable if Gilgamesh even requires a master at all, or at least one that isn't Kirei, and it's even more questionable that he's the one used for the Grail instead of someone like Rin. What little impact he does have on the plot is wrought with contrivances or conflicts with his character, a character that I can only imagine was written so you can hate him, and as I said, that is limited.
You're not meant to like this disgusting, creepy, selfish, boastful, arrogant, deceptive, sniveling worm. But like other villains who share those same traits, such as Joffrey Baratheon and Eric Cartman, he's just meant to be the target of your hatred so that you can feel satisfied when he's finally defeated. But that only works if the villain can properly antagonize our heroes, which Shinji fails to do in any meaningful capacity. He's so incapable as an antagonist that there's almost no point to hating him because you know that he will get what he deserves very quickly. Contrast this with Cartman. He is arrogant and self-absorbed without any regard for others unless it also benefits him. He also has no shame or moral compass. He will fraternize with people he hates and change his beliefs to get what he wants, all of which describes Shinji, and these aspects make it that much more satisfying when Eric gets what he deserves. But that's only because he is effective as an antagonist. For fuck's sake, the kid murdered a mother and father, cooked them in chili, and fed them to their son. Scenes like this only feel good because of how scarce those moments are, or how much effort it takes to build up to them. Ryder and Shinji almost never win, so why should I feel satisfied when they lose?
While I wouldn't describe him as a good character, he's not necessarily a bad character either, just incredibly one-dimensional. He's not doing Blade Works any favors, as far as its writing goes, though that would normally leave enough empty space for the servant to fill in, but if the problem wasn't apparent enough, Ryder is barely in Blade Works. She has lines in a single episode, and never speaks again before her death. Though that doesn't mean that there isn't anything to say from the short amount of time that she's been on screen. There's actually quite a bit that could be said about her encounter with Shiro and Rin. For starters, given the trajectory, we know that Ryder was aiming for Rin, yet as soon as Shiro leaves to chase after her, she doesn't try looping back around to finish off her target while she's still out in the open. Further, she doesn't bother to kill either Shiro or Rin while she had the chance. She could easily kill them if she wanted to, especially as Rin comes to rescue Shiro. Ryder could use him as a human shield while she stabs him and waits for him to die, and also close the distance between herself and her original target, killing two birds with one stone. Or one body, I suppose. If there's any reason she didn't do this, we'll never learn it here. In fact, this is also a problem on Rin's part, aiming while Shiro is in the line of fire, risking accidentally shooting him instead. And what do you have left? A character that is defined as behaving evil purely for evil's sake, and still fails to actually be evil. While there is so much about the dynamic between Ryder and Waver, exponentially less could be said about Shinji. He is not the kind of character that is even worth praising in a story, whereas a duo like Ryder and Waver take great care to focus on the development of their relationship, how to best further it alongside the rest of the cast, and play the theme of said development in a way that complements the rest of the story. And the best thing is that they didn't need to be written that way. Neither character have any relation to Stay Night, and could have just been about as impactful to the story as Kojiro was to Blade Works. Just doing what they need to service other characters without having very much character at all. But because someone tried, they have become two of the most thematically important characters in the entire story. Shinji Matou is just the guy. You don't have to try to write someone like that. It takes little effort to come up with someone who's unlikable, and I don't think there was any attempt made to write Shinji beyond this superficial caricature. Or perhaps it was never determined that there needed to be. That's probably the most frustrating thing about this character. This isn't the route we're supposed to learn about him. Given his relation to Sakura, and her importance to Heaven's Feel, we can probably expect both Ryder and Shinji to be more fleshed out in that route. But until that video, these two are just average at best, barely more noteworthy than background characters. Although Shinji isn't the only one who hasn't yet been fully expanded on. I had purposefully neglected an important element of Iscandar's character, that being his rivalry with Saber, so what better way to talk about it than to examine Saber herself.